I'm Dutch, as you may have guessed. And I came to Ireland first as a master's student, and then I did a project on sand dunes and salt marshes in Wexford. But then later I did a PhD project on the vegetation of Irish bogs. And that started in 1978, and I did research for 5 years. And what I found in those years is that I'd selected sites that I wanted for my research, which were reasonably intact. And what I was studying is how vegetation in bogs changes from east to west going through the country. So how the closer you get to the Atlantic Ocean, the vegetation in bogs changes. So that was my research subject. So I'd selected some 20 sites in a transect across the country, from the Midlands to the west. And then in the years of the research, I found that a number of the bogs that I was working in were being drained and prepared for cutting. And so I got a bit worried, and then tried to find out what the fate would be of the other bogs that I'd selected. And their fate wasn't looking too well, because most of them were owned either by Bord na Móna or were on lists to be cut and drained. So that's when I started to talk to people in the Wildlife Service about my findings. And they also got rather worried, because in that time, the late 70s, early 80s, the feeling was, there's plenty of bogs. We have good bogs everywhere, so we don't need to worry. But then we realized that bogs were dwindling very fast, and that something needed to be done. And people in Nature Conservation Ireland said, Jesus, it would be very difficult to get a public support of bog conservation, because that's the last thing that people want to conserve in Ireland. So if we want to get something done, we have to get international support. So then I set up a foundation here in the Netherlands, the Foundation for the Conservation of Irish Bogs. And then we started raising funds here in the Netherlands for Irish bog conservation, and all kinds of, we asked questions in the European Parliament, and we did a lot of lobbying. And within a couple of years, we raised sufficient funds to buy 3 sites in Ireland, which in '87 we handed over as a gift of the Dutch people to the Irish people, but as nature reserves. And in the same time, in Ireland, we also set up the Irish Peatland Conservation Council, which is still very active. So that was my involvement in bog conservation in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. And that led ultimately to an appointment as a visiting professor in UCC and the National University in Galway. So since then, I've always been coming back to Ireland, teaching and doing research. So I by now feel that Ireland is my second home.
Yes.
Well,
you've earned your I don't know if you've heard of your title as the father of peatland conservation in Ireland, but you've definitely earned that title.
I start to feel old, Caroline, when you become sort of a grandfather. But I'm also very, very happy looking back. We started in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was absolutely no bog conservation awareness in Ireland. I mean, people didn't think about bog conservation, and very few sites were conserved. There were a few sites. There was, for instance, Rahinn Mór bog, which had been handed over by Bord na Móna to the state as a nature reserve, and there were a few bits and pieces elsewhere in the country. But apart from that, nothing was conserved. I mean, you see how much is conserved now. Ultimately, it was a very, very successful path that we all walked towards conservation peatlands. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing the change if you think of it now, because everyone is aware, especially now, I think, with the climate change issues and the potential for bogs to contribute there. So everyone is aware of them. So yeah, I didn't realize that you had done a master's in sand dune ecology and salt marsh ecology as well.
That's where it all started.
Would it be true? That's where it all started. Would it be true to say that you have a kind of a special interest in peatlands? I know you're obviously interested in all ecology, but
yeah, basically I love all ecosystems, but sand dunes and salt marshes are still very close to my heart, simply because I was a young student and then I worked in Wexford, and I really fell in love with sand dune systems. And since then, I've had various Dutch PhD students who worked on sand dune systems in the Netherlands. So that connection has always remained. But of course, when I started working in bogs, that became the central focus of all my ecological studies. And bogs still fascinate me enormously. and I find them absolutely mesmerizing ecosystems. And I was back, because that's when we met, I was back, 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago in Ireland, to revisit sites that I studied in the 70s and 80s with a PhD student who's now going to redo some of the work I did in those years to see, because I mapped quite systematically the vegetation patterns in a number of the bogs. And these maps are still there, these vegetation maps, and he's going to redo them. And now it's much easier because he's using a drone. In my days, I had to work with tape measures, etc., etc. But it's redoing the mapping to see if climate change has affected the sites. But being back in sites that I hadn't seen for 40 years, Caroline, this was almost like entering heaven. It felt like it was so wonderful to be back in places that I walked when I was a student or a PhD student, and still finding them there. They were still there and now conserved. All the sites that we visited on this trip all had the signs, National Heritage Area or Special Area of Conservation, and that made me enormously happy.
I can imagine. Yeah. What were the main differences, I suppose? Or did any differences strike you between the sites when you saw them in the 70s and 80s and in 2021 this year?
Yeah, I have to be very careful of what I say, because my PhD student is going to work 4 years in this project, and he's going to really look carefully at all the data to see if there is a change in vegetation. But I can tell you what I noticed at first glance is that the mountain bogs, Schlieve-Bloem, for instance, I worked in Schlieve-Bloem, and the Wicklow Mountains, in as far as there has been no burning, because there has been a major fire in the Wicklow Mountains, I think 3 or 4 years ago. The sites that have not burned, that they look very much as I remember them. And the same applies to the Western blanket bogs, the sites that we revisited, that I worked at in the 70s and 80s. They were virtually the same. And I could immediately walk to the areas that I mapped, and they looked like they looked 40 years ago. There were changes in the raised bogs. And there it's rather difficult to say. They in some bogs, they were clearly drier than I remember them. Some bogs had quite a lot of open water pools when I worked there, and they are now all terrestrialized. They all have sphagnum growing in them. But there it's not clear whether that is climate or human impact, because all the sites that I worked at, the raised bog sites that I worked in the 70s and 80s, have since then all been affected by marginal drainage, because that marginal drainage and peat cutting has gone on, has basically continued in most of the sites until quite recently. And that marginal drainage and peat cutting affects the whole system. So we have to find out whether the impression that I had that some of them were definitely drier than I remember them, whether that's climate or whether that's human impact. So that's not clear yet.
Yeah. There's I suppose that's one thing that struck me as a younger student, and hearing about how important our raised bogs are, and when I started working as well in peatland conservation, and they're so important on an international scale. We have some of the best raised bogs left in Europe, and
Absolutely.
yet they're so threatened by marginal drainage and obviously internal drainage as well in the past. And it's quite frightening to hear figures like we have about 1% left of our original active raised bog, with about 1% left, they reckon. So it's kind of frightening. And I think the national target is to, within the National Parks and Wildlife Service, who are responsible for the conservation of these sites in special areas of conservation, the target is to reach 2% of active raised bogs, which sounds so low, but yet, you know, the practicalities of it, I assume, to reach anything higher would be beyond.
Quite impossible, and also very expensive, because restoration of bogs is extremely expensive. But still, to put it into perspective, Caroline, in the Netherlands, what we have left, and I don't know whether you knew this, but at some time, about 2,000 years ago, percentage-wise, we had more bogs than Ireland, because about 55% of this country was once covered in bogs. And that has been systematically cut and drained. And what remains is 10,000 hectares of cut-away peatland. We have no intact sites or semi-intact sites. The only thing that we have remaining is cut over bog without any active aquaterm or active bog growth remaining until about 20 years ago, when we decided that those 10,000 hectares were of importance ecologically and also from a historical perspective. So we started regeneration and rehabilitation projects about 20, 30 years ago. And we've spent many millions of euros in trying to re-wet them with dam systems and keeping rainwater on top of them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was involved in an assessment of the area of active accurate helm that we now have in the Netherlands. That means living bog vegetation in the Netherlands after all the restoration projects. And we did a survey about 5 years ago, visited all the sites, systematically looked at how many meters squared or acres of living accurate helm had developed. And that was not more than 12 hectares. And that has been reduced by 2 hectares in the last 5 years because of climate change. The point is that we spend millions and millions to have about 10 football fields of living bog surface at the moment, whereas what you have remaining in Ireland, still active, compared to that is massive. But it's very important to keep it conserved, because otherwise it will go the same as it went in our country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's somewhere around 1,600, 1,700 hectares of active peat. So when you put it in that context, it sounds fabulous.
And it is much cheaper maintaining it than trying to recreate it. Yeah.
Yes. And do you think we're doing enough in Ireland to protect the active raised bog that we do have?
I think, I mean, much more could be done. I mean, I feel that the whole process of phasing out marginal peat cutting has taken much too long. You know, all these sites that became special areas of conservation. All the marginal peat cutting should have stopped immediately. And what also should have happened is that restoration measures should have started immediately. That would have prevented many hectares of good raised bog drying out further. Now, I see all the political problems, and I see all the problems with local populations and with the image of people, and also of course the historical right, and also almost the cultural right to be able to cut peat. So I see those problems. I also see, of course, that politically it never was an easy ride. So with all these drawbacks, I'm quite happy that with what has happened, and I feel a lot of progress has been made since, let's say, the 80s and the 90s. So much more could have been done, and ideally, I think much more could have been conserved as well. But I'm not unhappy with what is there now. I mean, as I said, my journey through memory lane to 6 weeks ago was a happy journey. And of the sites that I now revisited, there were 2 that were truly damaged, one by drainage and the other one by forestation, but the other ones were well conserved. And in some sites there were also restoration projects in progress. So that I'm not unhappy. But that doesn't mean that we now can sit down and do nothing anymore, because we still have a road to travel.
Absolutely, absolutely. I suppose one of the things, the main focus, I should say, of the FarmPEAT project is obviously working with the marginal areas around the raised bogs. So our focus is actually on the agricultural land surrounding. We have 8 raised bog sites within our project, and most of them are either SACs or NHAs. So we kind of feel by working with these farmers, if we can achieve any re-wetting of these peat soils, it's kind of, it's buffering the raised bog as well, helping to keep the water at the, at a higher level, but also obviously from a carbon emissions perspective, we're hoping that it will contribute to reduced emissions. And obviously there's lots of challenges there as well in terms of the agricultural productivity of these lands and the potential losses to farmers. And I was interested to hear you at the Peatlands gathering, you mentioned because 50% of the Netherlands was once basically raised bog,
yes,
and now it's predominantly agricultural. This is a huge problem also in the Netherlands. What's kind of happening there, or can you fill us in a bit?
Yeah, the problem is, or the situation is, that the western half of the country, the eastern half is higher sandy soils, but the western part of the country used to be bog, and that bog has been reclaimed. It started basically in the Middle Ages and has been systematically reclaimed since then, and on an industrial scale, because people might not realize that the wealth of the Netherlands in the 17th century was based on the access to cheap fuel. That Amsterdam grew into a major city with worldwide trade was basically because there was peat around everywhere. And what happened in the west of the country, that's basically half of the country, that all the bogs were cut away and then poldered in. They're all polders where we constantly have to pump water away because we're under sea level. But the agriculture that's there now, is all agricultural land, is basically on peaty soils. It's not on, because the peat hasn't gone away down to the underlying sea clay level. The farmers are largely farming on peat, drained peat that has been fertilized, etc., etc. And so the rest of the country is farmland on peat. And what has been happening and that's becoming clearer and clearer in the last decade, in order to keep farm life viable, you have to drain these pools to a certain level. You have to make sure that your groundwater is at least, let's say, 0.5 meter under the surface to 70 centimeters on the surface. So, and that's constantly being done. At the same time, what's also happening is that the peat is subsiding, because it is a peat soil. So the drainage has to be deeper and deeper and deeper all the time, which ultimately has repercussions for a city like Amsterdam, because the drainage of all these agricultural lands surrounding Amsterdam, where the water level has to go down again and again and again because of the subsidence of the peat, means that now a city like Amsterdam, which is built on oak poles, all the houses in the center of Amsterdam stand because Amsterdam is built on a cut over bog, and all the houses are basically on peat, would sink away if we didn't have oak poles, tree trunks under the houses, drilled into the mineral subsoil, and that's what the houses stand on. What is now happening is that because of the lowering of the water table for the agricultural lands around Amsterdam, the top parts of these poles are not underwater anymore, and they start to rot. And the houses are sinking because the poles are rotting away. So there's a problem. We have to lower groundwater tables constantly for the farm environment, but for the city, that's disastrous. That's one thing. The other thing is that we are now also more and more aware of the fact that these western peatlands, which are used for farming, are basically enormous sources of carbon dioxide and methane emissions. And so from the climate point of view, but also from basically management of our Western cities, and also from the point of view of managing wildlife in the West, we need to raise water tables to make the soils wetter, so that less carbon and less methane is emitted, that our cities don't sink away any further, and that we can also maintain whatever wildlife there is. But that, of course, is something that immediately conflicts with farm life, viable farming. So that's one of our major challenges also politically in the Netherlands at the moment. If you really want to contribute to preventing when we want to lower our carbon emissions, we also have to re-wet our Western peaty agricultural lands. And that has great repercussions. Unless, sorry?
No, go on.
I wanted to add one thing. Unless we change our farming methods. What our farmers in the West do, they either raise cattle or all kinds of crops on these peaty soils, and you need relatively dry soils. But you could also, and there are all kinds of experiments happening in the Netherlands now, you can also think in a completely different perspective and start farming on wet soils. And start what, you know the term, paludiculture. You can start to grow typhi, you can start to grow watercress, you can even start to grow sphagnum, because peat moss is quite important in the horticultural industry. Now it's harvested from bogs, but you could also commercially grow it on re-wetted peat soils. So that's if that perspective would be traveled, that road would be traveled, would mean that we could have viable farming in the west of the country with different farm output, of course, at the same time reduce carbon emissions and also restore a certain level of biodiversity.
And is there much acceptance of this with the farming community, or is there a lot of resistance, or how far?
As usual, and you will come, I assume you come across that in your work as well, the traditional farming community is strongly opposed, but there's a generation of young farmers who see perspective. They suddenly see, you see, because in the Netherlands we have a gigantic problem. I don't know whether you're aware of it, Caroline, but the High Court stopped all building in the Netherlands. It's now more than, I think it's almost 3/4 of a year ago, because our nitrogen levels in the country are so high that all our nature reserves are suffering from nitrogen deposition at levels which are not permissible anymore by European legislation. And what has happened is that the Dutch High Court decided that our country is in breach with international legislation by allowing high levels of nitrogen, too high levels of nitrogen emission. And the High Court decided, I think it's about 8 months ago, that no further building activity can take place in the country until nitrogen levels have come down. We cannot build roads at the moment. We cannot build houses. All building activity has been stopped in this country for 7 months. We have an enormous housing crisis, in the sense that there's not enough houses for our population, but we can't build. And that has to be resolved. And so 40% of our nitrogen emissions are from farming. But the farming lobby is so strong that until now, nothing has happened on that level. But we now have a new coalition government. So I think now major decisions have to be made, because unless we reduce the amount of cattle in this country, nitrogen levels will not go down. And that basically means that all building activity in the country remains at a halt. So a lot of farmers, especially young farmers, from this perspective, feel that there's no future for them in this country, because we're so densely populated, and farming produces so much nitrogen emission, and also contributes to carbon emissions, that farmers feel that unless we have a different mode of farming, there won't be a future in the Netherlands. And so there are a big number of young farmers who look at agriculture as an interesting way to go, who look at what we call environmentally friendly farming as a way to go. We have more and more farmers who now cooperate with nature conservation organizations, where the farmers basically manage old semi-natural landscapes for the conservation organizations by using traditional farming practices, and they're being paid for that, and quite handsomely paid for that. And a lot of young farmers see a future there, because that's a sustainable future. So we have the traditional group, of course, in opposition, but you see there's an emerging group of younger farmers who feel that it is time to change farming methods. Okay,
interesting. I didn't know that about well, I knew there was nitrogen problems, but I didn't realize there was no building allowed on the back of that. Yeah. That's quite serious. In Ireland as well, you're probably very well aware, we've obviously started re-wetting our cutaways, and Bord na Móna have started re-wetting some of the Bord na Móna cutaways. Do you think that we will achieve kind of meaningful reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, I suppose, from those areas anyway?
I hope so. You see, the problem is that re-wetting is a tricky business. How you know that re-wetting first can lead to higher methane emissions in the beginning of the process, and we have to wait till that is over. And then it's crucial that re-wetting is such that you get a good, sound carbon sequestering vegetation. If that's not there, the whole exercise is futile. So re-wetting it's not just re-wetting and everything will be honky-dory, No, it has to be re-wetting with an ecological perspective. And if you will be able to basically, I don't think it will be easy to restore bog functioning completely, but at least to rehabilitate to such a level that we get a vegetation that stops further carbon emissions and even can sequester carbon, yeah, then it can absolutely help in our counteracting climate change. And I think Ireland has great possibilities there, because you have such an amount of cut over bog which can be used to sequester carbon.
And in the Netherlands, you've been re-wetting peat soils for a lot longer than we have, and your cutaways. So have you been monitoring the changes in greenhouse gas emissions? Have you seen a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes.
And
if it's done well, absolutely, there's a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I can tell you, Caroline, that now, you know, Staatsbosbeheer, the National Forest Service of the Netherlands, for which I still work, which is basically our Dutch National Parks and Wildlife Service. That's the State Department for Nature Conservation. They have now decided last year that in their contribution to counteracting climate change, they're going to plant 5,000 hectares of new forest, and they're going to re-wet 5,000 hectares of cut-over peatland, just to reduce emissions. So that's the objective for the next 5 years. So that's being used as a major tool in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, and it can be successful if it's done well.
There's a strong move here as well in terms of planting trees for carbon sequestration as well. And I suppose one of my concerns would be obviously to keep them away from the peat soils. Is that something that the Dutch government are doing?
No, absolutely. You shouldn't go and plant them on peat soils, because if you want to plant them on peat soils, at least good, whatever, if it's non-coniferous, broadleaf trees, first of all, what normally is planted on peat soils is conifers. And in order to have conifers grow, you have to drain, and that drainage leads to greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a futile exercise. If you want to grow forests and peatlands, then you have to grow willow forests or alder forests that can grow in extremely wet circumstances. So no, I don't think that's a good idea, planting forests on cutaway peatlands as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because your soil will constantly be emitting greenhouse gases while your trees are growing and sequestering carbon. So no, I don't think that's the ideal way to go.
And in the Netherlands, do they very clearly keep that separate? You're not allowed to plant.
They keep it absolutely separate. The planting of the 5,000 hectares of forest will be on drained sandy and clay soils that are naturally reasonably drained, and the re-wetting of drained cutaways, that will be with the objective of creating new wetlands, not forests.
And in terms of, I mean, you mentioned how densely populated the Netherlands is, and I'm not quite clear in the farming. I know obviously most of the farming is on peat soils, but is there a lot of farming also on these dry, sandier soils?
Oh yeah,
and there be a lot of
the other half of the country is drier sandy soils. And there's also farming everywhere. I mean, I would say about 65% of the Dutch areas under farmland is farmland. And in the east, we have another problem. See, the west, we have the problem that's all peatland. That is subsiding through the drainage with all the problems associated. On the eastern sandy soils, there is also intensive drainage, and that has led to we had, this year was reasonably normal, but before that we had 3 extremely dry summers. And in these 3 extremely dry summers, the groundwater table in the east of the country, in the drier part of the country, lowered in areas with more than 1.5 meters. And the winter rains couldn't fill the groundwater reservoir anymore. So in 3 subsequent years, the water table was so low in our eastern sandy soils that our native forests are dying. We have big forest areas with native trees that are dying from drought. So there is now, we know now that we need to do something in the drainage systems in the east that are there for agriculture in order to maintain our forests. Otherwise, we lose parts of our forests, apart from all the nature reserves in the east that are also dependent on a certain amount of groundwater. So yes, we have some major problems there.
Yes, it's all down to the water, isn't it? Keep the
it's
water,
all down to the water
where it should be. Yeah. So just thinking back, I suppose, when you were a student in the 70s and 80s in the Netherlands, presumably you hadn't seen active, a kind of relatively intact raised bog.
Oh no, not at all, Caroline. I had seen
So the first time.
The first bog I saw in Ireland, I think, was Raheen Moor, which is a Midland raised bog. So no, that was a new world to me. Absolutely. And the world, Caroline, what happened is in that first summer that I was there with two other students. I was a PhD student, and they didn't allow me to do the work on my own because they felt bogs are too dangerous to walk on your own all the time. So I'd always had some MSc students with me. And the first year I had two MSc students, and we were preparing, basically selecting sites across along a transect across Ireland. And the first year we only looked at the Midlands. In the second year we traveled from the Midlands to Galway, and from the Midlands to Mayo, Sligo. And in that Midland research, we had about 2 months where we were just, what we had is aerial photography. On the aerial photography, we saw whether there were reasonably intact bogs were still remaining. But that aerial photography that we were using was already 10 years old. So when we saw the good site on the photograph, went there, and then it was cut, or it was on the drains, or it was whatever. So it took us quite some time to find good sites. And that's also when I became rather worried. And then one day, that was towards the end of our survey, on a Saturday, we decided to take a day off, and we went down to Clonmacnoise. And on our way to Clonmacnoise, we saw on the right-hand side of the road, and I remember this perfectly, it was around 12 o'clock, noon, we saw a bog, not very big. And we looked at each other and said, God, we haven't seen this bog yet. Should we go and see it? And we were tired. I mean, we were tired of all the bogs that when we eventually got there were then drained or cut. And so we said, yeah, it looks as dry as a bone and it's small. So, but ultimately, being Dutch with a work ethos, we thought we have to go and see it. So we went onto that bog. And have you ever seen Mungan Bog near Clonmacnoise?
Yes.
That was.
Well, I've never been. I don't think I've ever been on it actually, but just driven past it and seen it.
It was something I'd never seen before, Caroline. It had enormous system of open water pools. It was extremely wet. It was difficult to cross. So because it was completely what a bog should be. With enormous open water pool systems, sphagnum lawns, etc., etc. And we were mesmerized because we hadn't seen anything as good as that. But at one end of the site, there were drainage machines from Bortnamona because it was owned by Bortnamona. So what we did the same day, we called, have you heard of John J. Moore, the professor of botany in UCD? He has now died, but he was a professor of botany, and he was one of our contacts in Ireland. So I called John and I said, John, we found something that's absolutely superb. And he came over the next day on a Sunday afternoon, and he walked the bog and he said, my God, I haven't seen anything like this for 10 years. And on the Monday, he went into the Bortnamona head offices and said, there's a bog that you own. It's not very big. It's of crucial importance for Ireland because this is one of the best remaining sites in the Midlands, but you have started draining. We need to find a solution. And what then happened, Caroline, Bortnamona owned a part of a bog on the west of the Shannon. Owned a big bog in the west of Shannon, but a small part of it was owned by Antashk. And Antashk refused to hand it over to Bortnamona. And they always had to work around that small part that was owned by the Antashk. And that small part had already completely dried out and was ecologically useless, but Antashk held onto it as a sort of, how do you call it? A power aspect. And then a swap was made. Antashk decided to hand over that dried out bog remnant in a bog near the Suck River, and in change would get Mungan Bog from Bortnamona. And that was the beginning of that's the moment I realized, Jesus, something can be done. And that's also where my interest in conservation emerged. Before that, I was just a silly PhD researcher. I wasn't thinking about conservation. But then suddenly all became alive.
I can't imagine you ever being silly, Matthijs.
and that bog, I visit it whenever I can when I'm back in Ireland. And Caroline, sometimes I get very depressed about everything that happens in the world, and as you may as well be, because things are not always going well. And when I sometimes think, Jesus, my whole life has been useless, then I go back to Mungenbog and stand on it and see that it's still there. And then I think, all right, something is still okay in this world.
That's a good place to go. So I must go there.
You must. It's absolutely fabulous.
Yeah. That's gone out of my head now what I was going to ask you next. But just in the meantime, given your passion and interest in peatlands, if you had to pick on a raised bog, if you had to pick one plant as your favorite, what would you say is your favorite plant?
Narcissium. The bog, what's it called? Bog asphodel, eh?
Yes.
Yeah, I love its color. The yellow flowers in spring. Whenever I visit the bog in spring and it is in flower, I immediately feel radiant because it is such an enormously bright yellow in this grayish, reddish, greenish expanse of bog, and then in autumn it gets these absolutely wonderfully orangey seed pods. So that's absolutely my favorite. I love it. And you know, in our country, it's extremely rare. I was a student when I first saw it somewhere in a wet heath in the Netherlands, and already then I was mesmerized. But I remember that my professor said, this is an extremely rare plant. And then when I was doing my work in Ireland as a PhD student, there were millions of them in the bog. Yeah. So that's always been my absolute favorite.
I think it's a lot of people's favorite from the bogs. Yeah, again, I suppose the color. Have you ever seen Tina Claffey's photography?
Oh yeah.
You know,
Tina became a friend over the years, and there's one book that she had done several books, but a couple of years ago she launched a book, and I had the honor to launch it in Dublin, and that's when we first met, and since then we have been in regular contact, and I think she does fantastic work. Yeah.
She really does, yeah, because she brings a new sort of perspective on them.
Yes.
With her macro lens. I can't think. I think I've covered all the questions that I had emailed you, and probably a bit more. I can't think of anything else, Matthijs, that we should cover now. And I probably kept you long enough anyway.
No, it's great to see you again. It's fantastic.
Yeah, you too. I couldn't believe when I saw you and Clara. I couldn't believe it was you. Yeah. But there you go. Life throws up surprises every now and again.
Yeah, and you know, Caroline, it sort of is that's the pleasure of being at my age. You again and again come across people that were either your students or you worked with, and they've chosen their own career, and then paths cross, and then it gives me the feeling that what I have always been passionate about, and that's of course nature and landscape, that work continues, that there's a new generation again who will be doing what is absolutely crucial in this world. I feel if the army of workers like you and all the other people in Ireland that are working for the quality of the green environment, whether that's landscape or nature, that army is crucial. If that army doesn't, because the forces in this world that work against us are vast. Huh? So we need to, and you know yourself, we need to spend a lot of energy to keep the what you call them, the Huns away from the gates. So when I see that there's another generation that's carrying on the torch, that makes me extremely happy. So